Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. Welcome to part 4 of my takedown of Knowing Better and his lies and misinformation about the Red Pill movie and the men's rights movement in general. So in this episode, I'm going to try to get through suicide, homelessness, and domestic violence.
4 of 5 suicides are men.
That was true when he said it, but it's actually closer to 3 out of 4 now, because female suicide has been increasing. Strangely enough, women attempt suicide more often than men. For every 3 men that commit suicide, 5 women attempt, and only 1 succeeds.
Well, he gets a lot wrong here, so it's going to take a little bit of time to go through the stats and show exactly where he's got things wrong or he's misrepresenting things. So I guess the best thing to do is to tackle the claims one at a time. So let's play that first one again.
4 of 5 suicides are men.
That was true when he said it, but it's actually closer to 3 out of 4 now.
So I think it's very important to say right from the start that I'm using his citations, okay? I'm not using some bias MRA citation which Knowing Better would call into question. I am using the citations that he has put in his description, and they do not support his claims. So Paul says that 4 out of 5 suicides are male. In other words, another way of looking at that is that male suicide is 4 times higher than female suicide. But Knowing Better says there's been an increase in female suicide, which is true. He forgets to mention there's been an increase in male suicide as well. And he then concludes that it's now 3 out of 4. In other words, 3 times as high, which is wrong. His own source says the suicide rate amongst males remained, notice the word remained, nearly 4 times higher than among females. So let's have a look at those statistics. So I think the year Paul was talking about would have been 2011 or 2012, something like that. Let's go with 2012. The suicide rate for females was 5.4 and the suicide rate for men was 20.3. So if we do some quick math, 20.3 divided by 5.4 equals 3.75, which is nearly 4 times as high. So obviously Paul has rounded up. Now let's look at the figures for 2017. We have 22.4 divided by 6.1 and we get 3.67, which is a slight bit lower than the stats that Paul gave us, or the stats from 2012 I should say. So yes, there has been a slight increase of females compared to males committing suicide, but instead of rounding 3.67 up to 4, he's decided to round it down to 3.
4 of 5 suicides are men.
That was true when he said it, but it's actually closer to 3 out of 4 now.
Which I personally would think is pretty dishonest, especially considering his own source says that the rate remains nearly 4 times higher. So what we see here is he's starting to create the narrative that, yes, it's a male issue, but what about the women? Let's go on to the next bit.
Strangely enough, women attempt suicide more often than men. For every 3 men that commit suicide, 5 women attempt, and only 1 succeeds.
Okay, I admit to being a little bit confused at this point. When I first watched this video, I thought this part was going to be easy to debunk because I've debunked a very similar thing 100 times before, and will do so again in a minute. But when I rewatched it, I realized that he was saying something different. Let me explain. Normally, whenever an MRA brings up male suicide, the automatic response we get from feminists is, but women attempt it more often, meaning women attempt suicide more often than men, therefore somehow that's more important. Somehow living women are more important than dead men. Now, for the record, I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about people who attempt suicide. Of course we should, and we should be helping those people, be they male, female, or whatever. But it's a really shitty tactic to bring up people who are alive and compare them to people who are dead and somehow try to make the argument that the living people have it worse, and therefore we shouldn't be concerned about the dead ones. And what's even worse about this is they only ever bring up female suicide, be it dead women who have actually committed suicide or living women who have attempted, when MRAs bring up male suicide. It's not an actual concern for them until we start talking about male suicide. Then all of a sudden it's the most important thing in the world, and it should be the focus of all our attention, because you can't actually admit that men have an issue, can you? But that's what we normally hear. We normally hear women attempt it more often than men, etc., as an attempt to shut down conversation. By the way, that's a bullshit statistic, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. But Knowing Better is saying something different. He's saying for every 3 men who actually commit suicide, 5 women attempt it, but only 1 succeeds. Well, the first issue with this statistic is, as we just saw in the previous segment, it's closer to 4 times as many men committing suicide to women, as opposed to 3 times, as he would like us to believe. The second problem with this is he doesn't take into account males who have attempted suicide and failed. He is giving us 2 sets of statistics for women, that is, attempted and completed, and he's comparing it to 1 set of statistics for men, which is completed. And in doing so, he's trying to create the narrative that this is somehow a bigger problem for women. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, I checked his citations and there's no mention of this statistic anywhere. Now, I notice he does this a lot. He'll flash up a statistic on the screen or he'll mention it, but he won't show where he got it from. He won't show it in proper context. Now, to give him credit, he does have citations down in the description, but it makes my job a lot harder to find exactly where he got that stat from and its proper context if he doesn't actually show it. You'll note that when I show statistics on screen, I tend to show the heading of where it's from, the website or the organisation or the study, and I'll show the snippet, right, a paragraph explaining it, or a graph or something like that, right, that people can actually visually see, as well as having the link down in the description so anyone can go and check it themselves and make sure I haven't taken anything out of context. But if they choose to do so, it's a lot easier for them to find where it came from, or at very least, just to see it in proper context on the screen. We don't have any of that here. We just have a stat which supposedly comes from one of his citations, but having read both of them, it doesn't. And I don't know where he got it from. I don't know where it came from. It's almost like he made it up. I did a search on the internet and couldn't find it. So I don't know. I don't know where he got it from. It's strange. So I don't know if he's being sneaky here and showing us 2 stats for females and comparing it to only 1 for males, which obviously isn't a fair comparison, or whether it's a mistake on his behalf. I mean, who knows with this guy? But let's assume for a second that he did just stuff up and he was just parroting the normal feminist response to MRAs talking about male suicide, and that is to parrot off that women attempt suicide 3 to 4 times as often as men. Simply not true. Let's look at some stats. And for the record, I'm using his citations for this. Now, let's have a look at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I know this website well because I've done numerous videos on male suicide in the past. If we come down to suicide attempts, it gives us a lot of information. Now, the bit I'm going to focus on first is the bit about the survey. It says, based on the 2017 National Survey of Drug Use and Mental Health, it is estimated that 0.6% of the adults aged 18 or older made at least 1 suicide attempt. This translates to approximately 1.5 million adults. Now here's the important part. Adult females reported a suicide attempt 1.4 times as often as males. Further breakdown by gender and race are not available. Now, they do also list another survey, but that's for youth in grades 9 to 12. So it's a lot more limited, and the findings show that female students attempted almost twice as often as male students. So neither of these support the 3 to 4 times as often myth which we hear all the time, but I'm not finished yet. Let's have a look at the 2017 National Survey on Drug Use and Mental Health, because Knowing Better's second citation actually also uses this and gives us a little bit more information. Now, his second citation supports the first one 100%. If we look here, females are 0.7 and males are 0.1, which is basically the same numbers. They're just halved here, right? The others was 1 and 1.4. So basically the same. But when we look at how the data was collected by the survey, it's got here survey non-response. Reasons for non-response to interviewing included refusal to participate, 23.1%. People with suicidal behaviour may disproportionately fall into these non-response categories. 32.9% of people they attempted to survey did not complete the survey. That is a massive amount. That is almost a third of the people that they approached to do the survey did not want to do the survey. Now, I would speculate that males who have attempted suicide and failed may not want to answer a survey about it. Males are less likely to want to talk about suicidal thoughts, let alone talk about attempting and failing suicide. So I don't think the differences are that big to begin with. And then if you take into consideration the number of people who refuse to do the survey, and then you take into account that a large percentage of them were most likely male, I think it would be fairly safe to speculate that the numbers for females and males attempting suicide are probably a lot closer than people like to think. Definitely nowhere near the 3 to 4 times higher rate that we often hear. Now, if we go back to the first citation, it says, in the US, no complete count of suicide attempt data are available. The CDC gathers data from hospitals on non-fatal injuries from self-harm as well as survey data. So we're talking about not only the surveys, which has 1/3 of people not responding, but also data from self-harm of people going to hospitals. Now, the self-harm data is not broken down into suicide attempts and non-suicide attempts. So you may have a situation where someone has been cutting themselves, it gets out of control, and they end up going to a hospital, and that is classed as self-harm, even though it may not have been a suicide attempt, and it's not always easy to tell. If you class all self-harming behaviour as suicide attempts, you basically inflate the figures. It would be like someone campaigning against drink driving, and instead of using just the statistics for people who have died on the road due to drink driving, they instead used the entire road toll, including people who died in car accidents which were caused by things other than drink driving. It's an incredibly dishonest tactic. Unfortunately, it's one we see all the time.
Men successfully commit suicide more often than women because men choose more violent methods, like jumping off of things or guns.
Okay, serious question. Is there like a book called something like the Big Feminist Book of Refuting MRA Talking Points or something like that? Because they all use exactly the same arguments over and over and over again. I've heard this argument so many times I'm fucking sick of hearing it. Actually, Big Joel even used it, and not surprisingly, Knowing Better has linked to his videos in the description. What a surprise. Of course, this is an oversimplified explanation as to why more men commit suicide than women. Now, sure, using more lethal methods may be a factor, but it most definitely is not the only one. But for some reason, they never bring up those other issues, those other points of view that we should be talking about, the other reasons why men commit suicide more often. Now, I read a blog years ago which summed up this pretty well. It's only a small section of text, so I'll read it to you. Men might be more often past the stage where they want to make a cry for help, or they might not feel comfortable making a cry for help, or they might not think that a cry for help will be effective. From Wikigender, greater social stigma against male depression and a lack of social networks of support and help with depression are often identified as key reasons for men's disproportionately higher levels of suicide, since suicide as a cry for help is not seen by men as an equally viable option. And I think this really hits the nail on the head. I think we should be talking about this more than saying, well, men use more lethal methods, and there's actually more women attempting suicide, so we should be talking about the women, and it's just macho men and their guns, really, so it's not really much of a concern. But what about those women? What about the women? That's what we really need to focus on. No, we should be talking about male suicide and why males are less likely to reach out for help, why they feel that they can't get help. Might it be that society sees them as more disposable? Might it be the empathy gap? Might it be that society cares more about women's well-being? Yeah, that wouldn't work out too well for the feminist narrative, would it? So I guess you should just stick with men use guns more often, therefore that's why men die more often, right?
Firearms account for just over half of all suicides. Women tend to choose less violent methods like drug overdoses or cutting, which have a very low probability of success.
And what does that tell you, knowing better, or what should it tell you? Well, let me explain it to you. It might mean that some of those females aren't really that serious about committing suicide. It might tell you, if you actually stop and think about it, that maybe in a lot of cases it's a cry for help. Now, for the record, we should take those cries for help very, very seriously and do everything we can to help those people. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't. But the point is, when men typically commit suicide, they have a very, very different attitude because they don't think anyone is listening. They don't think there's a point in making a cry for help, because if they do, it's just going to be ignored, or they're going to be blamed, or it's going to be dismissed. Exactly like what Knowing Better is doing in this video. And every other feminist, every time they bring up, but more women attempt suicide. Can we talk about them? Can we stop talking about the men who have actually killed themselves? Can we not talk about the actual issues that cause men to commit suicide at almost 4 times that of women? And instead, can we talk about the women who attempt it? That form of dismissal makes it harder for men to come forward, to seek help, to talk about their feelings, to talk about their issues. And feminists like Knowing Better are part of the problem. They're effectively making the situation worse, not better.
This is a valid issue because, as I said, men are far less likely to seek help. We live in a society that looks down on men who ask for help. So maintaining that pride leads men to things like suicide, drug and alcohol addiction, and homelessness.
Absolutely fucking amazing. So he starts out by inflating the number of females committing suicide to make it seem like it's closer to the number of men committing suicide. He then compares the number of women who have committed suicide and the number of women attempting suicide to the number of men who have succeeded in committing suicide. Of course, completely ignoring the men who have attempted and failed, because, that would actually show that it's a bigger issue for men, right? And that's not his goal here. His goal is to make it seem like this is more of a female issue, that more women are attempting suicide, and it's only because men use more lethal means that it's a higher number for men. That's the only reason. It's not actually that there are more men attempting. No, it's just that they use guns. That's all. And then after using all these dismissal tactics, which we hear time and again from feminists, over and over again we hear these same fucking bullshit arguments to derail conversations about male suicide. But after all that dismissal, finally he says, well, it's because, men are less likely to seek help. Yeah, I can't think why they would be less likely to seek help when assholes like you are dismissing the very notion that they might need help. That while ignoring the factors that cause men to commit suicide in the first place. Why not talk about the spike in suicides when men go through a divorce, when they lose access to their kids? You could have brought that up. You could have talked about that. But no, you totally ignore that. No, it's about the guns. It's about women, right? Couldn't possibly talk about the spike after a divorce, because that would actually be talking about a men's issue, and you don't want to do that. Not unless you have to. So I find that statement at the end incredibly disingenuous. If that was really a concern, he would have brought it up from the start, and his whole talk would have been about that. Because that is the key issue here. The fact that men feel that they can't come forward, and they can't talk about their issues, and they won't be listened to, and they won't be understood or have any sympathy or empathy. That's why they don't use suicide as a cry for help, but instead use more lethal means. Okay, now that we've listened to him butcher the statistics about suicide, let's see what he does with the stats for homelessness.
Is a man broken?
I like this one because they're putting their thumb on the scale a bit. Single homeless. So if you're married and homeless or have a child and homeless, you don't count.
Mate, you don't get to accuse others of putting their thumb on the scale when that's all you do every time you bring up statistics. Okay? I mean, talk about the pot calling the kettle black. That's fucking unbelievable. And also, when they use the word single, I don't think they're referring to someone's marital status, okay? I'm sure there are men out there living on the street who are technically married, even though they may not have seen their wife for many, many years. Now, as for couples with children or single parents with children, yes, they are of a concern, obviously, because children are involved. And you know what? Those people get priority. And for the record, I'm not saying they shouldn't. Once again, children are involved, so obviously they should get priority. But you will find that they will get a roof over their head immediately or almost immediately. Now, there may be some families that slip through the cracks, and maybe, you know, they're living in a car or something like that. And this could also depend on where they live. But in most places throughout the Western world, they will get priority and they will get help almost immediately.
In truth, men are 60.2% of all homeless people. In homeless shelters, 55.4% are men, which is actually pretty even. But when it comes to actually living out on the street, 70.3% are men.
Homeless stats are a lot trickier than a lot of people might think they are. When people think of homelessness, they think of someone living on the street, and sure, that is part of the definition, but it's not the entire picture. Basically, to be classed as homeless, you just need to be without a permanent residence for a particular night. So that includes people who are in homeless shelters or in accommodation which they've got through their council or through a charity. Maybe someone staying in a motel out of necessity because, you know, maybe they've been kicked out of their home or something. Or maybe you're staying at a relative's place or a friend's place. This is often known as couch surfing. Now, obviously not all these things are equal. Another factor is it's often hard to estimate these things. It's often hard to estimate how many people are living on the street or how many people are surfing the couches of friends or relatives. So because of this, statistics around homeless people can vary greatly. For example, here's a snippet from an article by AVFM from November 2013. And it says, what about the percentage of homeless that are men? I found that the estimate for the percentages of men ranged from 60 to 80%. The US Interagency Council of Homelessness estimates that of the chronically homeless, 75% are male. 1/3 of those are veterans, and in case you're wondering, 97% of homeless vets are male. So in case you're wondering what chronically homeless is, that means that's someone who's been homeless for a year or longer and has some kind of disability. So that could be mental illness, or it could be substance addiction, or something like that. An article in The Guardian from 2013. It's hard to track down official statistics on homelessness that take account of gender. But in 2011, the housing charity Crisis found that 84% of the hidden homeless were male. And the latest chain figures suggest that 9 out of 10 people sleeping rough are male. According to Mankind Initiative, in UK refuges or safe houses, there are 33 spaces dedicated to male victims of domestic violence, of which 18 are for gay males only, compared to around 4,000 spaces reserved for females. And I would assume that women who are staying in domestic abuse shelters would also be counted as technically homeless. So as you can see, the stats vary greatly depending on how you look at them and where they're from. But one thing does stand out. It doesn't matter which group of statistics you look at. When it comes to people sleeping rough or the chronically homeless, they are predominantly male, and they typically range between 70 to 80%. Now, I do have a lot of sympathy for someone who's couch surfing and, maybe for a couple of months they're struggling staying at a friend's place or a relative's place, trying to get back on their feet. And I do have sympathy for a domestic abuse victim who's staying at a shelter. And I do have sympathy for a family which is staying at emergency accommodation supplied by a council. These are all issues that need to be dealt with, but they all have a roof over their heads. They're able to cook a meal and take a shower and work to getting their feet back on the ground. If you're unemployed, for example, it's much easier to get a job if you're staying at a friend's place as opposed to sleeping on the streets. So as much sympathy as I have for all those people, I have far more sympathy for the people who are sleeping rough, especially in the middle of winter, and especially in cities which have fairly cold or brutal winters.
Again, men don't like asking for help.
So, time and time again, he keeps on bringing up the idea that men are less likely to ask for help. And for the record, I tend to agree with him, but he never really goes into it in any depth. He never really explores why men are less likely to ask for help, apart from saying it's pride. And obviously it's a lot more complex than that. And if you really cared about understanding the topics that MRAs bring up, then he would explore why men are less likely to ask for help in the first place, and also that men are less likely to receive help. Now, to really illustrate this point, I want to show you a clip of a male victim of domestic violence who's talking about his experience, and it really ties in to the 3 topics of this video. He talks about being suicidal, he talks about being homeless, and obviously he talks about domestic violence, which is our next topic in a couple of minutes. But he also talks about trying to get help and being ignored or not taken seriously, which, might suggest that's one of the reasons why men are less likely to ask for help, right? Would have been nice if Knowing Better had explored that a bit. But no, he's been too busy playing around with statistics to actually do that.
I said to my now ex, can I have some money to get the boys some presents? And she turned around and said that a real man wouldn't be begging his wife for money, he'd be out earning his own instead of being a lazy cunt. She'd turn around and punch me in the head in front of a young bloke. She came in and was just verbally assaulting me. I ended up in a fetal position, sucking my thumb on the shower floor, just screaming inside, I can't handle this. And she was saying, you might have a doctor's fill, but you haven't got me filled. There's nothing wrong with you. There's never been anything wrong with you. I was ostracised from family and friends. I was constantly told that even my own family didn't want anything to do with me because I was mentally ill. I just turned around and I looked to see if there was a truck coming down the road, because I would have just jumped in front of that truck a lot of shame. There was a lot of numbness. I went through a lot of depression. Rang up Department of Community Services, and I was told by a woman on the end of the phone, "Sorry, I don't believe you because only men abuse women. You don't fit into any of our programs, we need you to do an anger management course." And I said, my ex spat at me, she threatened me with knives, she bit me, she punched me, she withheld money, she verbally abused me, and you're telling me I need to do an anger management course. It's hard to admit that you're in an abusive situation to begin with, because society says that females don't abuse men. And it took me a long, long time to even admit to myself that I was a victim of abuse. I became homeless because of abuse. I had nowhere to go. So when I rang up the government services, "No, we don't believe you." When I told other people, they'd say, "No, I don't believe you." And you know, the best thing that you can ever say to someone when they tell the story is just say, "I believe you."
So this all ties into society having less empathy for men. This is known as the empathy gap, and this is why men are less likely to ask for help. We've been trained from a very young age not to bother because, that men don't get help, right? Men just shouldn't ask. Now, we're going to explore domestic violence next, but before we get to that, I do want to go back a couple of minutes and explore something that Knowing Better said in a little bit more detail. It didn't quite sit well with me when I heard it, but I didn't say anything when I was previously recording. But now that I've had to think about it, I do want to go back and address it. And it's basically Knowing Better putting his thumb on the scale, as he called it. Let me play you that clip and then I'll address it.
In homeless shelters, 55.4% are men, which is actually pretty even.
Okay, so let's have a look at his citation and see if it supports his claim that 55.4% of people in homeless shelters are in fact male. So the statistics say that out of the sheltered people, 55.4% are male and 44.4% are female. So what's the issue here then? Well, it says sheltered people here, not homeless shelters. And there is a difference. If we go to the terms used in this report, we find the term sheltered homeless refers to people who are staying in emergency shelters, transitional housing programs, or safe havens. Transitional housing programs provide people experiencing homelessness a place to stay combined with supportive services for up to 24 months. So essentially, the statistics he showed us are not for homeless shelters, but for all types of shelters, which I would assume includes domestic violence shelters, which are predominantly focused on women. Now, I would argue there's a big difference between spending a night in a homeless shelter and spending 30 days in a domestic violence shelter where you have a whole range of services to try to help you get back on your feet. And the reason why this is disingenuous is because he specifically says homeless shelters, and he's creating the impression that your typical homeless shelter is almost 50-50, and I just don't believe that's the case. Now, I tried tracking down actual gender statistics for homeless shelters, and I couldn't find any, so I'm happy to be proven wrong. If someone can find statistics on gender in homeless shelters specifically, and not a wide range of different shelters, and those stats support Knowing Better, I'm more than happy to admit that I'm wrong. But as far as I can tell, he has mixed numerous different types of shelters in with homeless shelters to once again water down the stats. Why am I not surprised? Anyway, let's move on to domestic violence. And the topic of domestic violence shelters will be coming up again.
And now that I've mentioned shelters, I'm gonna have to talk about domestic violence.
As of 2016, there's only a single domestic violence shelter for men. My initial reaction was that there needed to be thousands more women's shelters because that many more women are being battered. But as it turns out, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be victims of physical violence by an intimate partner.
If your alarm bells and red flags aren't going off, they should be. That statistic is true. However, the definition of physical violence in that survey includes literally any form of physical violence.
So our alarm bells should be going off because the stats are actually true. Okay, that's an interesting argument. Interesting that you would choose to go with that. And then he says the definition of violence is any form of violence. Fascinating. See, I wouldn't have figured that. The definition of violence actually being violence. It's amazing.
From pushing to slapping to throwing something at you.
So are you suggesting that it's okay for a male to do those things to a woman? Yeah, I don't think you are. I think you're saying that it's only okay or acceptable when a woman does that to a man, because that doesn't count, right? So what we see here is a very, very common feminist tactic when it comes to talking about domestic violence, and that is to maximize the definition of domestic violence concerning women, and this is to maximize the number of female victims, while at the same time minimizing the definition of domestic violence concerning men to minimize the number of male victims. For example, when feminists talk about female victims, they will say it's not just physical violence. Of course, it's also all types of physical violence, including pushing and shoving and throwing things. But it's not just physical violence, it's also abusive behaviour, it's also controlling behaviour, controlling finances, etc., etc. And to be fair, a lot of these things are really bad, and I'm not supporting them in any way, although occasionally it does get kind of crazy. I remember a university once putting out a list of things which it classed as domestic violence against women, and one of the things on the list was using logic in an argument. Of course, it's not domestic violence when a woman uses logic in an argument against a man. It's only when a man uses it against a woman. But excluding those extreme crazy things which are sometimes included, I would agree that most things which are included under the definition of domestic violence are bad. But when they start talking about male victims, suddenly it's only the most extreme things which count. Suddenly it's only the men which have to go to hospital because of severe violence that count. All those other things suddenly disappear. The controlling behaviour, the abusive behaviour, controlling finances, name-calling, whatever was previously listed as forms of domestic violence which have to be stomped out at any cost, suddenly don't count. Suddenly you're only talking about the men who turn up at hospitals having suffered severe physical trauma. And this is incredibly dishonest, but they go further. They actually go further than this. Often when they talk about female abusers, they will say that, yes, sometimes women use physical violence, but it's always out of necessity. It's always in self-defense. It's not that women can sometimes be abusive, right? They have no problem accepting that men can be physically abusive. But no, women need an excuse. It's never their fault. They're always responding to something that the evil man has done. Because somehow women are above men, right? Men are faulty and flawed and violent, but women are above all that. They're special. It's almost like feminism is a form of female supremacy. This is also why they don't have a problem acknowledging male victims of male perpetrators. Because, it involves an evil male perpetrator, and they can use that to demonize men. That's perfectly fine. But they almost never mention female victims of female perpetrators, Because, in that situation, you can't really blame a man, can you? You can't say, well, the woman was using violence in self-defense. Oh, hold on, it was against another woman, which means, we have a violent woman, and, we can't acknowledge that women are violent without them using it in self-defense, so we'll just ignore that. We'll just ignore the violence in the lesbian community. And for the record, lesbian relationships tend to be more violent than heterosexual ones. But, for some reason, feminists just totally ignore that, because that would be admitting that women can be violent. And that goes against the narrative of just demonizing men. That might contradict the narrative that women are somehow morally superior to men. But they go a step further than that too. I did a video on an article last year from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, so this is my taxpayers' money paying for this bullshit, where the reporter interviewed a female abuser, not that she was labelled that way, and of course we only got her side of the story, which was pretty damning. She said that she'd hit her male partner. He went and locked himself in a room and rang the police. The police turned up and treated her like she was acting irrational, which would suggest to me that she was acting irrational. And then they arrested her. Now, you're probably thinking that she's the abuser in that situation and the male is the victim, right? That would be the logical conclusion. But no, not if you look at it through the feminist lens. If you look at it through the feminist lens, then she is actually the victim and the male is actually the abuser, because he rang the police to get her in trouble. And we're told in this article that whenever men ring the police on their violent female partners, they're only doing it to get her in trouble. It's a tactic used by male abusers to further abuse their female victims. The violent women who are hitting them. And this isn't just a narrative which was put forward by the reporter, but she also interviewed a women's legal service here in Victoria who supported this narrative, that every time a man rings the cops on his violent partner, it's just a tactic by an abuser to abuse an innocent woman who has obviously never done anything. And if she has used violence, it's only ever in self-defense. That's the only way women ever use violence. And this legal service is now training police. So when the police turn up at a domestic abuse situation and the man looks like the victim, they now know that he really isn't the victim, even though he might be bruised or bloody, even though he might have called the cops on his violent female partner. The police now know that is just an evil tactic by the patriarchy to trick them into further punishing his innocent female partner, who obviously has never done anything wrong, because women are incapable of doing evil because they're morally superior to the evil men. This is the toxic narrative which is at the heart of feminism. This is why we can't trust feminists with any discussion about domestic violence, because it always comes down to this bullshit. And this is what we see Knowing Better doing here. Suddenly pushing and shoving and throwing things at people doesn't count if you're doing it to a man. Yeah, of course that's very abusive if you're doing it to a woman. But if a woman's doing it to a man, not that important. He should just man up and take it, right? Yeah, I can't imagine why men aren't coming forward for help. It's a real mystery. A real mystery.
From the infographic attached to that same source, women are far more likely to be afraid, far more likely to be concerned for their safety, and far more likely to develop PTSD.
So he minimizes violence against men, and now he's comparing that to the way women feel. If a woman feels like she's threatened, not if she's actually experienced physical violence, but if she feels like she's threatened, then that's a concern. But not actual physical violence, unless a man's put in the hospital, right? Now, I do have a problem with this survey, and that is that men are less likely to admit if they're victims of domestic violence. They're less likely to admit that they might fear their female partner, right? Now, this shouldn't be hard for knowing better to understand, considering he said things like this right throughout his video.
Again, men don't like asking for help.
So let me get this straight. When it comes to male suicide, he has no problem acknowledging that men are less likely to ask for help. When it comes to male homelessness, he has no problem acknowledging that men are less likely to ask for help. When it comes to men going to see a doctor, he has no problem acknowledging that men are less likely to go to a doctor when they need to and ask for help. But strangely, when men fill out a survey about domestic violence, they have no problem admitting that they're intimidated by their female partner or afraid of their female partner, or that they're victims of domestic abuse. For some reason, these same men who, are too proud, according to knowing better, to go to the doctor when they might be physically ill, have no issue opening up about being victims of domestic violence. I mean, not only are they able to admit to themselves that they're victims, which, a thinking person might say is a pretty big step in itself, but, they have no problem opening up to a complete stranger doing a survey. Yeah, I mean, that sounds fair, doesn't it? I'm sure those statistics are 100% accurate, and there's no discrepancy in accuracy whatsoever. Next.
Why is that if just as many men are victims? Because when we look at physical violence that actually results in injury, it's 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men.
Do I really need to point out again that if less men are willing to come forward and report that they're being physically harmed, then obviously the number for men is going to be a lot lower than what it is?
Again, men don't like asking for help.
So the first question we need to ask is, are men just as willing to go to the hospital when they're injured by domestic violence as women? The next question we need to ask is, are men and women going to the hospitals reporting domestic violence for the same type of injuries? I suspect that men only go to hospitals or emergency rooms when the injuries are the most severe and they can't deal with them at home. And I would suspect that women are less likely to do this. Now, obviously, there may still be a number of women who do not go to hospitals when they're injured in domestic violence, and sometimes those injuries may in fact be fairly severe. But like I said, I think men are far less likely to do so and will only go to hospitals in the most severe cases where they don't have a choice. But what about when men and women do go to hospitals? What happens then? Well, our hospital staff are trained to look out for people who have suffered domestic violence, and when I say people, I mean specifically women. For example, this article by a nurse who's talking about domestic violence screening in hospitals and how nurses need to be more focused on finding victims or possible victims of domestic violence. Now, throughout the entire article, she constantly refers to victims as women and children, although after a while she drops the child part and just focuses on the woman part. So the question is, does she mention male victims? Well, the answer is yes. She mentions them once. She says men can also be victims of this violence, but evidence indicates the majority of victims are women, and it is women who are more likely to suffer health consequences. Well, I'm not surprised she comes to that conclusion, considering the training is specifically looking for female victims. But imagine a woman turns up at an emergency room and let's say she's got a broken arm, and the nurse says to her, "How did this injury happen?" And the woman ums and ahs a bit, like she's trying to think up an answer, and she says, "I tripped and fell down the stairs." Now, the nurse might conclude that it's actually the result of a violent partner, and it may very well be. Maybe she was pushed down the stairs by a violent partner and she's trying to cover it up. Or maybe she did trip and fall down. But the point is, nurses are trained to spot and find female victims of domestic violence. And sometimes that's going to result in a false positive. They're going to see cases of domestic violence where it wasn't actually domestic violence. Now, the exact opposite is true for males going to an emergency room. Let's say it's the same scenario. A man turns up with a broken arm. They ask how it happened, and he ums and ahs a bit and says he fell down the stairs. Are they as likely to think that maybe a female partner pushed him down the stairs? Are they as likely to think that maybe it was a result of domestic violence? Probably not. Very doubtful, in fact. And once again, maybe he just fell down the stairs, or possibly he was pushed, and they're not going to ask those questions to try to determine whether he was or not. There's also the factor that even if he did come out and say that he was pushed down the stairs by his female partner, they're less likely to believe it or take it serious. So when you take into account all these factors, if we were to assume that domestic violence happens at similar rates between men and women, then it would not be surprising that there would be more women reporting serious injury than men. I should also point out that a number of men may be more willing to kill themselves than come forward and admit that they're victims of domestic violence. I recently saw a video by Philosophy Tube talking about this very thing. He talked about an abusive relationship he was in and how that led him to attempt suicide. I think it was about a year ago, something like that. And he talks about the trauma he went through and how it was a long process for him to even admit to himself that he was the victim of abuse and that he was in an abusive relationship, and how he would make excuses and tried to avoid admitting, even to himself, that he was a victim, let alone to anyone else. It's actually quite a good video. I'm not going to play a clip here because my video's already quite long, and his video is, I think, about 35 minutes if I remember correctly, and only playing you a short clip really wouldn't do it justice. So I'll leave a link below, and I highly recommend that you go and watch it if you're interested in more detail about this particular topic.
This is from her 2010 source, link down below. For every man that needed to go to a hospital as a result of domestic violence, 5 women did. Again, men don't like asking for help. For every man that needed housing services in order to get away from domestic violence, 6 women did. Again, men don't like asking for help. The red pill tries to portray this as some both sides in equal numbers issue, but it just isn't.
So once again, he's only using the most severe cases of domestic violence against males, that is, those males who have to go to hospitals, to minimise the impact on male victims. He doesn't take into account all the other forms of domestic abuse which males may suffer and need to escape, or the deadly consequences those other forms of domestic abuse may have. Once again, referring to the Philosophy Tube video, which once again I highly recommend you watch, link below. He says in that video that she only ever hit him once, but it was the emotional abuse, the constant emotional abuse, which drove him to try to commit suicide. Sometimes you don't need to put someone in a hospital to kill them. Sometimes the emotional abuse is enough to do even more damage. You don't need to stab someone if you drive them to step in front of a truck or shoot themselves with a gun or something like that. But of course, knowing better doesn't take any of this into account. And why would he, when he's just focused on female victims? Doesn't really care about the impact on male victims.
Domestic violence shelters were set up in the 60s and 70s when many women didn't have access to a job or money.
Now, interestingly enough, he's not going to mention that the very first domestic abuse shelter in the world was started by Aaron Pitsey, who just so happens to be a men's rights activist. He's also not going to mention that when Aaron opened her shelter for women in the 70s, she had a lot of men turning up at her doorstep in need as well. He's also not going to mention that Erin tried to open the very first domestic abuse shelter in the world for men, but failed because she couldn't get funding. That's right, we live in a patriarchy, apparently, which is only interested in helping men and keeping women oppressed, and it does that by providing money for domestic abuse shelters for women while totally ignoring male victims because, it's only there to benefit the men. He's also not going to mention that because Erin Pitsey cared about male victims of domestic abuse and was trying to open a shelter for them and claimed that domestic abuse is generational and not gendered, as feminists have claimed for the last 40 plus years. Because she put forward that idea, she was driven out of England due to the bomb threats she was getting from feminist activists. Not going to mention any of that, are you?
They had no resources and nowhere to go if they were in danger. Men, on the other hand, could go to a hotel or a friend's house or even a bar if they needed to get away.
Even a bar if they needed to get away. I can't believe he said that. That is fucking unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, what a great solution to male victims of domestic violence lacking resources. They can just go to a bar. They can turn up, possibly bruised or bloody, or, maybe suicidal, and just go to the bar and say, excuse me, Mr. Barman, but, I'm having some problems at home. I'm being battered by my abusive wife, and there's also the emotional abuse, which has me suicidal. Do you mind if I sleep under your pool table for a month while I get back on my feet? I'm sure the barman would say, yeah, that's fine. No problem. You go right ahead. There's already a couple of guys under there, so. So I wonder how Knowing Better would feel if Trump came out and said something like, we're shutting down all the domestic violence shelters for women because, they can stay at a friend's place or a motel or, maybe they can go to a bar because I'm sure that's equivalent to a domestic abuse shelter, right? No difference. Yeah.
Not the healthiest of options, but still options. But now there are domestic violence shelters all over the country which provide a place for women and men to go. That's right, I said men.
Okay, how many provide services for men, and are those services equivalent? Now, those are two questions that you're not going to answer, are they? I wonder why.
The domestic violence shelter that she says is the only one for men is not the only one for men. It's just the only one that serves only men. According to her source, nearly 500,000 male victims used housing services as a result of intimate partner violence. Where did they all go?
So he starts by talking about domestic abuse shelters, and then he gives us a citation which is about housing services. Now, obviously, domestic abuse shelters fall under housing services, but housing services are not restricted to domestic violence shelters. Now, I did look in the document for a definition of housing services, and unfortunately, there wasn't one. It would have been very convenient if there was a list of the different housing services that fall under the umbrella term of housing services, which means I can only speculate. And I suspect that housing services may include things like homeless shelters. So my question is really, really simple, and that is, do men seeking help from domestic violence get the same services as women? Are they of the same quality? Are they for the same length of time? Are they as easy to access? I suspect the answer to all those questions is no. And by the way, this is something that Knowing Better doesn't prove or show or address in any fucking way. What a surprise. He also doesn't address how many men needed housing services or domestic abuse shelters and got turned away because those services just don't exist. Apparently that's not important either.
Some domestic violence shelters are for women only, but almost every domestic violence shelter will help male victims either by housing them directly or by putting them up in a hotel free of charge.
Almost every. Well, that is strange considering your citations don't say that. The closest thing we get to that is in the article by the New York Post, which says some shelters house both men and women, but Denise Hines, a professor at Clark University in Massachusetts, who researches domestic violence by women against men, said it's more common for men to be put up in a hotel. That doesn't say almost every. So I'm not exactly sure where you're getting that from. Now, maybe you're correct. Maybe almost every domestic violence shelter does, at very least, put men up in a hotel. It would be nice, though, if you provided some evidence to back that up. But I do have to ask the question, how is putting a man up in a hotel or a motel equivalent to the services given to women? The answer is it's not. First of all, how long do they put these men up in hotels or motels? A night or two? Maybe a week? It's hardly equivalent to the 30 days, which is fairly typical for women at a domestic abuse shelter. Do they get the same services to help them get back on their feet that women do in a domestic abuse shelter? I'm guessing the answer to that is no.
There absolutely should be more domestic violence shelters for men, but framing it as if there's only one is a lie.
The red pill is about understanding that men and women, like everything else in life, it's a mixed bag. You've got victims and perpetrators on both sides of the fence.
That's true, but it's not even close to being 50-50.
When you have a system which is set up to see one gender as the perpetrator and one gender as the victim, and when feminists make excuses for female perpetrators and minimize the impact on male victims, or turn male victims into perpetrators, we should not be surprised that the statistics are skewed towards male perpetrators and female victims. To put it in terms that maybe a social justice advocate would understand, just in case there are any watching and they've made it this far, imagine you train the police to only see black criminals. Do you think they might arrest more black criminals than white criminals? And do you think the statistics would be a little bit skewed, maybe not totally accurate? That's what happens when you introduce a bias into a system, when you only see things through a particular lens, when you gender a situation, when you gender perpetrators and victims. And you may have noticed that all these issues that MRAs talk about are overlapping. So domestic violence can lead to male suicide or male homelessness, for example. And in all these cases, as Knowing Better himself pointed out, well, with the exception of domestic abuse for some reason, but in all these cases, men are less likely to speak up, they're less likely to seek help, and they're less likely to acknowledge that there's even an issue. And people like Knowing Better, feminists like Knowing Better, who constantly minimize and dismiss men's issues, and instead try to focus on female victims exclusively, that's part of the problem. That's adding to the stigma of men speaking up and seeking help. People like Knowing Better effectively make it harder for male victims to come forward. Anyway, this video is already quite long, so I'm going to end it there. And I think I'm now around halfway through Knowing Better's original video, so there's still quite a bit to go.
A new campaign is being launched today to raise awareness about male victims of domestic abuse. Tom Parmenter has been hearing one man's story.
In the mirror, Ian McNichol looks back at a man who was once broken, physically, mentally, and almost totally.
She was incredibly violent. I'll give you 3 or 4 examples. She placed lit cigarettes up my nostrils and forced me to go to sleep with those cigarettes still in my nose. She held my eyes open while she sprayed bleach into them. She assaulted me with a steam iron. She placed it on my left lower arm, on my upper right shoulder and in the middle of my shoulder blades. She boiled a kettle and poured it over my groin, and then whilst I was stuck to a leather sofa writhing in agony, she reboiled that kettle and re-poured it over my groin, and I'd got to the point where I was so mentally ground down I lost almost 25% of my body weight. I have 2 permanent indentations in my left shoulder where I was attacked with a hammer with such ferocity that the handle of the hammer actually broke.
His former partner is now serving 18 years in prison.
Her justification was that I didn't tell her often enough that I loved her and I didn't instigate the physical side of the relationship. That was her justification for the violence, that I'd made her feel unattractive.
Ian is now slowly moving on with rebuilding his body and his life. He believes a tip-off to the police from an anonymous neighbour genuinely saved his life.
A lot of people will just not quite understand how it can happen, how you can't stand up to that kind of abuse.
Sure. Well, of course, as a victim, for me it's a gender-neutral crime. What actually happens is that your feelings, I loved my partner, those feelings get abused. It's wrong for a man to hit a woman. Violence of any description is wrong, so it wouldn't have solved it. I can't say why she committed the level of violence that she did, but the fact is for men that the other additional difficulty is that they may not be believed if they come forward, so there's a challenge there. But all victims should find the strength to confide in someone because help is out there. I know that from my own experience and proof of that.
And as with any form of domestic abuse, deciding to find that help is often the hardest step. Tom Parmenter, Sky News.